Hey everyone, and welcome back to Inside Update, brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org, nonprofit journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut. It's been busy. There's been a lot going on, and today we have three topics to talk about. First, $8.5 million of psilocybin mushrooms in Burlington, Connecticut. We're going to talk about this week's investigation, authored by Marc Fitch. Pariah. This has a new format. We're going to get into the details, the different approach that Marc took. And the third one is a Bridgeport FOIA case that raises some interesting questions about access to justice in Connecticut for incarcerated individuals. Let's jump right into this, though. Trisha, you wrote about $8.5 million of psilocybin mushrooms. The pictures were crazy. Give us the lowdown here.
Yeah, the pictures were honestly the craziest part, which I didn't even notice until I was basically done writing the story. I was like, oh, this keeps scrolling. And I kept scrolling, and there were like 10 pictures from this arrest. So it's about this 21-year-old guy who lives out in Burlington. Um, so his neighbors basically like tipped off the police that there was like some weirdness going on over at his house. Basically, like they thought there was some kind of grow up. They probably thought that it was marijuana and not mushrooms. But it was definitely mushrooms. So the police from the state police, their narcotics North Central office, and the DEA's Hartford Task Force, they showed up at his house. His name is Weston Soul, and they found like ventilation equipment, or like it looked like he was ventilating something out of his house. So they asked him if they could go in the garage, like a detached garage in the property, and he let them, he walked over with them and opened it. And that was full of mushrooms, but those were quote unquote not illegal. So like I guess just regular mushrooms. And they wanted to go in the house, and he said no. So they had to go and get a search warrant. Obviously, they went and they did it. So according to police, they walked inside and they found what they estimate as $8.5 million in street value of psilocybin mushrooms, which are magic mushrooms for people who don't know the technical term. And so he was arrested and charged with obviously possession with intent and with like operating a drug facility. I don't know what kind of like time drug facility carries. I couldn't find it when I was looking it up in the state statutes, but possession with intent carries a maximum 15-year prison sentence on your first offense. And psilocybin is categorized as a Schedule 1 drug, which is the same as marijuana in a lot of cases and is the same as things like heroin. Um, Things like methamphetamines, most prescription narcotics, in some cases cocaine, are listed as like less horrible Schedule 2 drugs and carry lower sentences. Schedule 1 narcotics are like the worst of the worst, and all of that comes from like the drug war back in the 70s and 80s. Um, and it's honestly like the story itself is interesting. It's that number is huge. It's a giant. If you look at the photos, it's a humongous amount of mushrooms. Like I can't imagine someone was living in this house with the number of mushrooms that were like shown in these photographs. But I also thought it was interesting from a different perspective because there is this push to decriminalize, or in some cases legalize, magic mushrooms, specifically for medicinal purposes. So we're basically looking at magic mushrooms the same way we've been looking at marijuana the last decade or so, as this like it's not addictive. It's people have seen like there's evidence, or at least there is speculation that there are medicinal properties. I found a 2017 study that said psilocybin in small doses with therapy can help with symptoms of depression because it creates serotonin in your brain, which is necessary for helping to treat depression. They've talked about using like LSD and other hallucinogens to treat PTSD and other mental illnesses. So it was interesting to me to see someone being arrested for, I mean, a huge amount of mushrooms, but also the way that we persecute drugs that we're also presently having conversations about not being criminal or at least being medicinal. So like the state of Connecticut had a bill in this past legislative session to decriminalize half an ounce or less possession. So like you would still be charged, but it wouldn't carry prison time. It would just carry a $150 fine. So it'd be okay basically to carry this thing, not in the quantities that he had, but in like very small personal use quantities. And then there's also a few years ago a law on the books to require the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services to study the medicinal effects. So like I know Yale has been doing medical studies. Like you can look up current running studies online on through the government, and they will show you like a number of places. But I know that Yale's been doing some studies about like the effects, like what can psilocybin help with. They've been doing one for migraines and a few other things. So it'll be interesting to see the results of those studies in a few years. But it's always interesting to me whenever we persecute or prosecute certain drug offenses and the way that we're still sort of wrestling with these decisions that we made like 4 decades ago.
Yeah. Michael Pollan has that How to Change Your Mind on Netflix too, which dealt with this a little bit. It hadn't occurred to me on Friday when I was reading the draft, but kind of that idea of, you know, people's lives are being changed, and it makes it kind of tough to see these articles come up. And 21-year-old too, you don't, I think that's heartbreaking in many ways to know that this kid could likely be in prison for a long time. That being said, I don't know. Obviously, we'll have to follow this as the legal proceedings come out, if he had been doing harm in other ways or if there's other elements there. That's fascinating. The pictures, though, I didn't realize too there were things that were not psilocybin mushrooms. So he's growing portobellos in the garage.
They did not list what other kinds of mushrooms were there. They just said they opened the garage. He said those aren't illegal, which is probably why he said, yeah, you can look in the garage. And then they were like, all right, we want to look in the house. And he was like, you cannot do that. So they went and they got a search warrant and they found a whole bunch of other mushrooms. So the police are saying that the estimated street value is $8.5 million. I don't know what the street value of magic mushrooms is. I have never purchased it. But whatever that is, that's how many mushrooms he was allegedly growing. There are, like, if you look at the pictures, there are a ton of mushrooms, but I don't personally know the difference between magic mushrooms and I know portobellos, but like shiitake mushrooms or like other kinds of mushrooms that there are. Like, so is he also supplying like grocery stores? I have no idea. But the concept to me is always like, it's interesting because of the volume of drugs, but it's also interesting to me, like I said, because of that, this whole idea, like, Nixon and Reagan intentionally like asked for certain types of drugs to be classified as worse than others, particularly marijuana and hallucinogens, because they were intentionally targeting hippies and Black people and Jews. I think in Nixon's case, there are recordings of him like literally saying this. So it's always fascinating to see like we're still dealing with the ramifications of the war on drugs, the way that it was originally set up, and the fact that we're not going back and looking at these like different drug schedules and seeing like, does that make sense? Like, should marijuana and LSD be on the exact same level as heroin? And I think above fentanyl and things like that. I've done a few of these stories and I can never remember exactly what the schedules are, but there are a lot of really hard drugs that are less high than marijuana, at least at a federal level.
You might have to take a closer look at this. Just how 21 years old producing this kind of volume. There's a lot of questions there, but also, religious expression barriers, the operational elements. How did this come to be? I know we'll move on to the next topic, but that was a really interesting topic. And if you haven't had the chance to read it already, anyone else who's watching this, Trisha brings a lot of different pieces into this to kind of provide the holistic picture about, what the research is in Connecticut, for example, who's looking at this and what they're trying to discover with a substance that has been barred from medical science for quite a while now. I'd like to move to Pariah. So I want to talk to Marc. Two things, I guess, right off the bat here, Marc. One, this was a different format. And this was something that you had come to after you started looking into this. You did the interview. I'm really curious, what is this about, and why did the new format, the interview format, fit for this?
Yeah, so Pariah is basically, it's about William Maizano. He is a resident of Guilford, Connecticut. He's been very active in not in the Board of Education, but active doing a lot of issues within the Board of Education in Guilford. He ran in 2021 along with two others on a platform of trying to get race-based DEI teachings out of the school system. He and his colleagues lost that election, but he's continued to speak at Board of Ed meetings. And in in July of 2023, just this past July, he was arrested for sending an email to the high school principal saying that there would be, quote, hell to pay if a well-known gym teacher dyed her hair rainbow during graduation ceremony. They interpreted that email as being threatening. I mean, he even followed up saying by hell to pay, I mean media exposure, but it didn't matter. They arrested him for breach of peace, and he's now, going to court over this. He says he's going to, he's already rejected their plea offers. He's going to take it to trial because he believes that this is a First Amendment issue. But, I've written about Guilford a number of times because it keeps coming up, especially in this Board of Education issue. So, I mean, I had seen William Maisano speak at Board of Ed meetings, and he was always very, very calm and collected and seemed, reasonable and trying to, so when I saw that he had been arrested, I was like, I don't know, maybe he just went off the deep end. I didn't know. And there are issues around the, quote, hell to pay, whether or not that constitutes a threat. So we ended up deciding to sit down and have a chat because really I'm more interested in, he's clearly in the minority down in Guilford. It's it appears to be a left-leaning blue town. Maisano and his compatriots lost big time in their Board of Ed run. So, but he just keeps going. And so what interests me is people's motivations around this, right? When you're constantly pushing this kind of activism, I'm just like, I personally don't feel I'd ever have the energy to do it. So, what is somebody's mindset? What is driving them to do this? And so that's what I want to find out. I want to find out what his motivations were and what the cost is, because there's going to be a cost for, social activism on some level, whether you're left or right or whatever issue you're, advocating for, you could be arrested, maybe during a protest or something like that, or in his case, get arrested for sending an email. And so I want to know, because he's so well known in town for what he believes, is there a social cost for it as well? And so I went down to his house, met with him. We sat down and we spoke for over an hour. And just considering the length of the interview and the wide range of topics that we covered, I mean, we covered everything from certainly his motivations, what drives him, his regrets over, how things have shaken out for him, socially, and people he's known in town throughout the years, and political issues that he's faced or is facing, and how he's portrayed in the media. Because it was so wide ranging, it would have been very difficult to kind of get into a narrative form. And I honestly wanted people to hear his voice, because I think that's been kind of drowned out in the coverage of, his campaigns, his advocacy, his arrest. So I wanted people to get a feel for who he is. Is he this like right-wing wingnut, right? Or is he something else? Or is he something in between? And, it's very hard when you get to know and speak with an individual to really just kind of nail them down as one thing or the other. It's impossible. That's what makes us, humans and complex creatures. So because I found it, fascinating, I said, I think this would just be better presented in his words rather than me trying to gather it all together and present some kind of narrative. So let's just go straight interview format. I obviously put in context in the conclusion, discussing some of the free speech issues around his case. But I thought that was just the best way to go in this instance, so that people could actually hear directly from him rather than from me.
It worked. It came across as human too, and credit to you for I know that's not an easy task to kind of reparse those down to I think it's a 27-minute read on LinkedIn's preview estimate or something. Like, it's not a short read by any stretch, but you really were able to get it down to a clean read. And obviously credit to Joe for making it look pretty on top of everything else, and having it fit well with all the rest of the pieces on the website. I'm not even sure I have other questions about that. Trisha, Catherine, feel free to jump in. I'll mention briefly while you guys think, just that Catherine also has an investigation about plea bargaining and the Sixth Amendment that's relevant to this. And I think partially why he's pushing forward is just to make sure that his issue and his question doesn't just get buried in administrative outlets.
Yeah. And, like I said, he does feel it's a First Amendment issue. I talked to Mario Cerami, who's a big free speech attorney, and he said that this is, the arrest was absolutely a no-go as far as, free speech concerns are, factor in. But also it was just, some of the stories that came out, William Maizano, he gets painted, because this has been such a national issue, and you see videos of, parents yelling at school boards and, book banning and all these things. And he gets kind of lumped in with all these people, when sometimes what he's asking for or his viewpoints are much more nuanced than that. So I thought it was worth talking to him, and I thought it was, it's a good way. Everybody wants to paint the other side or people who disagree with them with a broad brush, and I don't think that doesn't really help people get to compromise or solutions that tend to move everybody forward. So I thought this might have been an opportunity for that.
Yeah, it's in the nuance, right? Yeah, journalism by humans for humans. I love it. That's spot on. Hearing nothing, Trisha, Catherine, I don't want to cut you off. Otherwise, I'm happy to, Catherine, just dig into this Bridgeport FOIA case as well. Could you just give us the rundown? There was a lot there in the piece. I know it was kind of a one hit, but all the same, I think I read it 3 or 4 times just as part of the editing process to make sure I wasn't missing stuff as I went through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as we know at this point, Bridgeport, the city, has some issues complying with FOIA. There was recently a Superior Court ruling that went against Bridgeport. Yet again, as you mentioned, Connor, it is sort of, as any case that gets to a higher level court is going to be, it is a fairly complicated case. But sort of at the core of it is a gentleman named Marlando Daly, who was convicted of murder and incarcerated, at least the time that this FOIA request was filed in 2019. I do not know if he's still incarcerated. But he requested records relating to the Bridgeport Police Department's investigation of him and the murder charge against him. And he requested that the department respond within 14 days. They didn't, so he filed a complaint with the Freedom of Information Commission. The same day that he filed that complaint, Bridgeport actually did turn some records over to this gentleman, but a part of the contention here is they were heavily redacted, which is something that we currently have our own issues with here at CII with our FOIAs. But so basically, despite everything that was going on with his contention that the request hadn't been fulfilled and the fact that the city did turn some documents over, the FOIC decided to hold a hearing on it and ultimately ruled in his favor. And part of the issue was that he had requested that the records be produced within 14 days. They were not. FOIA has a component in it where if an agency is going to deny you a request, they have to do it within 4 days. And so that was part of when the initial FOIC ruling came against them. Bridgeport appealed it based on the idea that, he had requested 14 days. And so that had overturned the 4-day portion of FOIA requiring them to respond within 4 days. And basically a lower level court agreed with the city of Bridgeport and said that he had negated his rights under the law. That decision in itself was appealed by the FOIC to a higher level court, and the higher level court sided with the FOIC and basically said that the lower level court overstepped their bounds. But, as I said, complicated case. There's issues of inappropriate redactions by the city here. There's issues of, when exactly do you waive your rights under FOIA when you request that an agency respond to something in a particular time period. Part of the issue here also is that because this gentleman was incarcerated at the time, he did not file an electronic request. He filed a paper request through the mail. So there is some delay involved in that. So how does that factor into either the 4 days that FOIA stipulates, or if you decide to waive that and request another specific period of time? So I think that kind of gets, Connor, to some of the issues you alluded to about whether there are issues about access to justice when you're in prison.
That's fascinating. I mean, we deal with that, of course, and we are lucky enough to have access to technology and the ability to, freely move about our lives in a way to access this information as part of our jobs. So trying to do that, I feel like there's a whole other path of navigation here that is not clear in the state of Connecticut for anyone trying to access information quickly and transparently.
I mean, I gotta say the 14, he wanted them to respond in 14 days. I mean, I'd be personally shocked if I got an FOI response in, actually got the documents back within 14 days.
It was what, 14 months for your huge data?
14 months for about 6,000 pages.
Yeah, I've waited longer than 2 weeks for a lot less than 6,000 pages.
I think maybe this is a good place to wrap up, but Catherine, I think that if you could help clarify a little bit, because Connecticut has its own set of rules. So I think all of us have seen this in other states as well, where there's I've done this where they need to respond within 5 days or 7 days and then provide all information within 30 days or request an extension from you as the requester. So the power still rests with the person who's looking to gather information. In Connecticut, that's not the case. This can just stretch on, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Connecticut is pretty unique among states in that it does not specify an amount of time by which documents must be turned over to a requester. Maine is sort of the same, where again, you make a request and you can ask for them to comply within a specific amount of time, and they are absolutely not bound by that at all. There are requirements, as I just said, if they're going to deny a request, they have to do that within a specific amount of time. But short of that, they can slow walk it. They can drag their feet on redaction. And right, I think this is an issue that we've discussed among ourselves before: is how do you know when they're actually doing that in good faith or not?
You like to have that silver lining, or at least have that optimism, but I know that can feel challenging on a day-to-day basis when you're trying to dig up important information, especially for an investigation that's on a deadline. That doesn't make anyone's life easier.
No, I think we've all experienced that.
Without a doubt. All right. I think that's a good place to put a pin in this, unless anyone else has anything. As always, to all of you watching, what we've talked about today, it's just a small fraction of what we're writing about. We're putting out new content every single weekday and every single Sunday at InsideInvestigator.org. A huge thank you to our donors and each of our subscribers whose support allows us to do this work and in fact allows us to grow. We are currently hiring. We're looking to bring on another reporter to respond to the many, 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 many tips that are coming into our newsroom on a daily basis. Thank you for watching Inside Update. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.